Imagine a scene. France, one of the greatest powers in Europe, is in crisis. Its king, Louis XIII, dies suddenly, and the country finds itself in a situation that no one could have foreseen. The future of France no longer lies in the hands of a mature and experienced man, but in the hands of a boy of just 5 years old. This boy was Louis XIV, who inherited the throne in 1643, after the death of his father. He was no ordinary prince. On the contrary, he was about to go down in history as one of the greatest kings of all time. But who would have imagined that such a young boy would be capable of ruling an entire nation? Now, while you imagine the impact of this moment for France, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel, like it and comment on what you thought of this impressive beginning. Because the story of Louis XIV is just beginning, and you won't want to miss what's coming. With the death of Louis XIII, France was left without direct leadership. Since it was impossible for a 5-year-old boy to rule alone, the regency was assumed by his mother, Anne of Austria, with the help of Cardinal Mazarin, a shrewd politician and advisor to the king. But this period of transition, which was supposed to be peaceful, ended up becoming a scene of instability and chaos. France was going through a delicate moment. The nobility, dissatisfied with the growing royal power, began to rebel in a movement called the Fronde, which was a series of popular and aristocratic uprisings. The nobility wanted to regain the privileges that had been lost over time, and internal disputes were on the rise. Although the young Louis XIV had no power to change anything at that time, he was being shaped by these tensions. From an early age, he was exposed to these power struggles, learning in a vicarious way that the stability and strength of a monarch depended on unchallenged authority. However, what marked this period of childhood for the future Sun King was the careful observation of everything that was happening around him. He knew that sooner or later he would need to take control of the country, and he was preparing for it. But how would it be possible to rule such a vast and complex empire from such a vulnerable position? The answer, he believed, lay in consolidating absolute power, where he would be, without a doubt, the center of everything. This period of regency and turmoil was crucial to the formation of Louis XIV's character. He watched his mother, Anne of Austria, and Mazarin face enormous challenges as they tried to ensure peace and order in the kingdom. The boy watched, learned, and made mental notes about how he might one day reign with total control. He began to form the idea that royal power could not be shared. He wanted a centralized government where all decisions would go through him. The mark that this period left on Louis XIV was profound. When he finally assumed the throne as absolute king, he had already been prepared for the challenges of power, knowing exactly what he had to do to avoid the mistakes that had caused so much turmoil in the past. What he wanted most was to ensure that France would never again experience moments of uncertainty like that. And to do that, he would need to be the sole person responsible for the kingdom's most important decisions. But how would he do that? That answer would come soon, as he matured and especially as the events of Louis XIV's reign began to unfold. Upon reaching adulthood, Louis XIV wasted no time in taking control of his reign. In 1661, with the death of Cardinal Mazarin, his mother's chief advisor, he finally had the chance to rule on his own, without any more regents or external advisors. And it was at this moment that he did something that would profoundly mark his history. He decided that the power to govern would be his alone, without divisions or mediations. At the age of 23, a young king, with a new outlook on French government, asserted that absolutism was the only way to ensure the country's stability and prosperity. He believed that as king, he was the ultimate authority, the central figure in whom the nation should rely, and thus was born Louis XIV's famous motto, "L'État, c'est moi," or "I am the state." For him, the king's power should not be shared with anyone. He did not want to just rule like other kings. He wanted to be the figure of absolute authority, the center of all power. But absolutism did not just mean having power over others. Louis XIV was creating a model of government where he would be solely responsible for all important decisions, whether in war, the economy, or culture. The nobility in the church, which previously had great privileges and influence, would now be subordinate to the king. Louis XIV's first major change was the transfer of the royal court to Versailles. Versailles was not just a palace. He wanted Versailles to be the center of his absolute authority. He built a gigantic palace, adorned with riches and beauty, and made sure that the nobility lived there. close to him, so that they would have no room to rebel or seek power in the regions of the country. Everything was to revolve around him, and the court of Versailles was the physical reflection of this idea. It was not just a palace, but a political weapon. By having the nobility so close, he controlled them, forcing them to live under his rules, and constantly seek the king's approval for their positions and privileges. Versailles was also a place where Louis XIV cultivated the image of a divine monarch. He was no longer just an earthly king, but a king chosen by God. This kind of image was central to his reign. He wanted everyone to see in him the supreme authority, something beyond a mere human ruler. The court at Versailles, with its luxuries and daily rituals, was a way of demonstrating the absolute power and grandeur of his reign, which further enhanced his aura of divine authority. But while all this was happening, one detail could not be ignored: the cost of it all. Maintaining Versailles and supporting such a luxurious lifestyle was expensive. The construction of the palace and the patronage of the arts, for example, required enormous resources. Louis XIV did not hesitate to spend immense sums, believing that his image as king and the maintenance of absolute power were worth any price. However, this extravagant lifestyle would put France in a difficult financial situation in the years to come. Yet the true strength of Louis XIII's absolutism lay in his ability to centralize and concentrate power in his own hands. He used his authority not only to control government decisions, but also to dominate all spheres of the empire. Laws, taxes, wars, everything passed through him. With this, the figure of the king became something almost invincible, and his will became law. Louis XIV transformed France into an absolute monarchy, where the king was, in fact, the center of everything, the sole ruler, the only figure who mattered. But as he consolidated his power, new challenges also began to emerge. What were the limits of absolutism, and would the nobility, despite being submissive at Versailles, still be willing to cede so much power to the monarch? These questions would become more evident over time. Versailles was not just a palace, it was the epitome of absolute power and the embodiment of Louis XIV's reign. He knew that in order to consolidate his power, he needed to create a symbol of his authority that would be impossible to ignore. And that is exactly what he did with Versailles. The palace became the center of his empire, a place where the king not only lived, but where he embodied the grandeur of his reign. The transformation of Versailles began in 1661, shortly after Louis XIV decided to take full control of the government. Originally, Versailles was just a small hunting lodge belonging to his father, Louis XIII. But the young king saw enormous potential in the place. He wanted something more than just a royal palace. He wanted a palace that would reflect the magnificence and power of the monarch. Louis XIV spared no expense. He expanded the palace into one of the largest and most luxurious in Europe, with impressive gardens, elaborate fountains, and gilded halls. Each part of Versailles had a specific purpose: to demonstrate his authority, to reinforce the idea that he was the center of the universe, like the sun that gave life to the world around him. Versailles became a kind of physical representation of the absolutist ideology, where the king was the center of everything, and everyone around him was subordinate to his will. The palace was not only a place of residence for the royal family, but also a political and cultural center. Louis XIV brought the nobility to Versailles and forced them to live there, with the intention of keeping them under control and preventing any possibility of rebellion or competition for power. Life at the court of Versailles was full of rules and ceremonies, and the nobles competed with each other to see who could attract the king's attention the most. It was a constant game of intrigue, favors, and power, where the goal was to secure the king's approval. But it wasn't just the nobility that was present. Versailles also became a place where artists, musicians, and intellectuals gathered, all seeking royal favor. Louis XIV knew that art and culture could be powerful tools for cementing his image. He sponsored operas, ballets, plays, and paintings, all designed to glorify his figure and spread the idea that he was more than just a ruler. He was a divine monarch, sent by God to guide France. Furthermore, control over the nobility was one of the most important aspects of life at Versailles. By gathering the nobles in one place, Louis XIV made them dependent on him. They needed him to advance in society, secure titles and lands. Versailles thus became a great theater of power, where every move of the nobles was under the king's observation. The goal was simple: to keep them busy and distracted, away from the real politics of the country, and with no time or space for conspiracies. However, all this grandeur came at a price. The cost of maintaining Versailles was astronomical, and over time, this excessive luxury would become one of the greatest failings of Louis XIV's reign. Although the palace was the greatest symbol of his power, France's wealth was being drained. The country was overwhelmed by the costs of the court, wars, and the royal lifestyle. As Versailles glittered, France's finances were increasingly stretched. The magnificence of the Palace of Versailles also represented a mental and symbolic control over all of France. The subjects did not see just a king, but a nearly divine figure with absolute power. Versailles was not just a place of residence, it was a major expression of the absolutist ideology that would dominate France for decades. But the real question is, how would Louis XIV's reign and his extravagance at Versailles be sustained over the long term? What would be the impact of all this luxury on the kingdom's finances? Well, the coming years would show that Louis XIV's grand achievements came at a price, and that price would be one of the greatest challenges he would face in his long and impressive career. Louis XIV's reign was marked by greatness, but also by immense challenges, one of the greatest of which was the War of the Spanish Succession. It began in 1700 with the death of King Charles II of Spain, who died without direct heirs. This created a power vacuum and a fierce dispute between the major European powers over who should inherit the Spanish throne. Louis XIV, always on the lookout for opportunities to expand his dynasty's influence, saw a unique opportunity. He wanted to ensure that his line would have an even more dominant position in Europe. And the best way to do this would be to place his grandson, Philip of Anjou, on the throne of Spain. This move, however, provoked a huge backlash from the European powers, who feared that uniting France and Spain under one crown would create an empire so powerful that it would upset the delicate balance of power in Europe. Rival powers, including England, Austria, and the Netherlands, formed a coalition to prevent this union, and war broke out in 1701. The War of the Spanish Succession was not only a struggle for succession to the Spanish throne, but also a struggle for control of Europe. It involved military campaigns on several fronts and lasted for more than a decade, until 1714. Louis XIV, in his quest for supremacy for his dynasty, sent the French army to fight on several fronts. However, the war dragged on for many years, and the costs began to become unsustainable. France, despite having a powerful army, faced difficulty. The war was expensive, and the population was already suffering from heavy taxes and scarcity of resources. But the French king did not back down. He was determined to ensure that his grandson Philip would ascend the Spanish throne. Even as difficulties mounted at home and abroad, he continued to fight, believing that victory would bring lasting rewards to his line. And indeed, when the war ended, the Treaty of Utrecht was signed in 1714, granting France a partial victory. Philip of Anjou was recognized as King of Spain, but there were conditions. France had to cede important territories, such as the Netherlands, the Gibraltar region, and parts of Canada, to other powers. Although Louis XIV managed to secure the Spanish throne for his grandson, the victory came at a heavy cost. France's finances were in shambles, the country was in debt, and the war had left many wounds on the economy and the people. The French Empire, which had once seemed invincible, was now in a much more vulnerable position. Furthermore, France's victory in the war, while important, also meant that the king now had fewer resources to support his extravagant court and the vast empire he had created. The debts accumulated by the war began to weigh increasingly heavily on Louis XIV's reign, creating a financial hole that would ultimately be one of the factors contributing to the decline of the monarch's absolute power in the years to come. The War of the Spanish Succession also had a profound impact on Louis XIV's image. He had always been seen as the brilliant and invincible monarch, but now, with the costs of war and economic losses, the perception of his reign began to change. He was still the Sun King, but clouds were beginning to appear on the horizon of his reign, and the legacy of Louis XIV, which he had worked so hard to build, was beginning to be questioned. Louis XIV did not rule alone. In addition to his political and military prowess, he also used marriage as a powerful tool to consolidate his power and secure strategic alliances. The policy of strategic marriages was one of the pillars of Louis XIV's reign, and he knew that securing good international alliances was essential to strengthening France's position in Europe. One of Louis XIV's earliest and most notable marriages was to Maria Theresa of Spain in 1660, when he was 22 years old. Maria Theresa was the daughter of King Philip III of Spain, and this marriage served an important political function. It united the two greatest Catholic powers in Europe, at the time France and Spain. However, this marriage was not just a love match. It also served as a strategic political alliance. In addition, it secured Louis XIV a stronger position in the contest for the Spanish throne, which would later be instrumental in the War of the Spanish Succession. However, there was one important condition to this marriage. Louis XIV waived a portion of the dowry that his wife was supposed to receive, a gesture that, in a way, demonstrated his power and the absolute control he had over his kingdom. He did not need his wife's wealth to rule. He was already in a position of strength. But Louis XIV's marriage policy was not limited to alliances with Spain. Throughout his reign, he married his children and grandchildren into some of Europe's most influential royal families, always with the aim of consolidating France's position in political and diplomatic matters. Marriages with the royal houses of Portugal, Austria, and other European kingdoms provided France with a network of allies that could be called upon in times of need. However, Louis XIV's marriages also created some tensions. Many of the marriages, although politically advantageous, were not based on love. Maria Theresa of Spain, for example, although she was Louis XIV's official wife, was not the only woman with whom he was involved. The king had several mistresses throughout his reign, which led to some political and personal complications. The most famous of his mistresses was Madame de Montespan, a French noblewoman with whom he had several children, and whose power within the court of Versailles was so great that many believed she had more influence than Queen Maria Theresa herself. This situation generated intrigue and rivalry at the court of Versailles, where power struggles and alliances were a constant game. For Louis XIV, the policy of strategic marriages was a way of ensuring that he had control over the destinies of other royal houses, and also a way of ensuring the solidification of his power. But at the same time, he knew that this did not protect him from the personal consequences of his extramarital affairs. In short, the policy of strategic marriages was fundamental to France's continued status as a power in Europe, but it also served to show that even at the height of absolute power, kings could not escape the complexities and challenges of personal and political relationships. Louis XIV's marriages, while securing diplomatic victories for France, also revealed the more human and fallible side of his authority. One of Louis XIV's greatest achievements was the way he centralized power in his hands and transformed France into an absolute monarchy. Before him, the King of France, although powerful, still depended on advisors and local nobility to administer the vast territory. Louis XIV, however, wanted something different. He believed that power should be completely centralized, and he would be the sole person responsible for the important decisions of the kingdom. His goal was to unify the government under his leadership, making himself the absolute center of French politics. To achieve this, he began to take drastic measures. The nobility, which had previously had great influence in regional decisions, was stripped of some of its power. Louis XIV understood that if the nobility were kept in positions of power in their own lands, they could easily rebel and challenge his authority. To prevent this, he summoned all the great nobles to Versailles, the center of his empire, and made them live under his rule. At Versailles, the nobility were constantly under the watchful eye of Louis XIV and his courtiers. The nobles competed for royal favor and status within the court, and court life became a series of rituals and ceremonies aimed solely at pleasing the king. They depended on Louis XIV for their privileges and lands, which gave them a sense of power, but at the same time made them submissive to the king. In addition to controlling the nobility, Louis XIV also reorganized the country's administration to ensure that his authority was unchallenged. He strengthened the bureaucratic system and delegated the administration of different parts of the kingdom to loyal ministers, such as the famous Jean-Baptiste Colbert, his finance minister. Colbert implemented strict economic policies to strengthen the economy, promoting French industry and creating new tax regulations. He also focused on improving trade and navigation to ensure that France was financially self-sufficient, which allowed the king to finance his wars and maintain his luxurious court. This move to centralize government was not limited to domestic politics. Louis XIV also sought to expand France's influence in Europe. He wanted France to be the greatest political and military power on the continent, and to achieve this, he believed he would need a strong, centralized government. He directly involved himself in several military campaigns and sought to strengthen France through strategic diplomatic alliances. However, this model of centralization also had its flaws. The king's absolute power, which seemed unbreakable, led to increasingly risky decisions, such as his participation in protracted wars, such as the War of the Spanish Succession. These wars, however much they may have been motivated by diplomatic and dynastic issues, also reflected Louis XIV's desire to further expand his power, and in doing so, exhausted France's resources. The centralization he sought also meant that he was responsible for every aspect of the kingdom, and this became a heavy burden. France, which had previously been a powerhouse with multiple centers of power and local autonomy, was now entirely dependent on the will of the king. This created a vulnerability. If the king failed, the entire empire could collapse. Despite all the difficulties, the centralization of power was one of the main features of Louis XIV's reign. He wanted to ensure that there would be no doubt about who ruled France, and Louis XIV's absolute power became a model that would influence many European monarchies for generations to come. One of Louis XIV's greatest legacies was the creation of a standing army, which transformed France into a respected military power in Europe. Before his reign, armies were composed primarily of mercenaries and temporary volunteers, which made it difficult to maintain a cohesive and well-trained military force. However, Louis XIV understood that in order to secure absolute power and protect France from external and internal threats, he needed a strong, disciplined, and standing army. He took a series of measures to organize and modernize the French army. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, his finance minister, was crucial in this process, providing the resources needed to finance the creation of a standing army. With the centralization of power and the financial organization of the kingdom, Louis XIV was able to invest heavily in his military force, making it one of the largest in Europe. The French army was restructured to become more efficient and professional. Louis XIV made sure to train his soldiers, improve logistics, and ensure that his troops were always prepared for war. He established new regiments, experienced officers, and a strict hierarchy, which helped create a highly disciplined and effective military force. This new approach gave France an advantage over other countries, which still relied on more outdated and less organized military methods. Louis XIV also invested in modern military structures, such as frontier fortifications, which ensured that France was protected from invasion. He used his army in several military campaigns, including the War of Devolution, 1667-1668, the Franco-Dutch War, 1672-1678, and later the War of the Spanish Succession, 1770. The French army was instrumental in these battles, and often France's victories in European wars were attributed to the strength of its well-trained and led troops. However, this lack of resistance to constant war came at a huge cost. The expenditure on the army and military campaigns led to a huge public debt. In addition, the prolonged war and the need to maintain such a large army created political and social instability within France. Although Louis XIV's army secured many victories and helped expand France's borders, it also began to exhaust the kingdom's resources and put enormous pressure on the population, which was already burdened by high taxes. Still, Louis XIV's standing army set a new standard for European armies, and was one of the greatest military legacies of his reign. He not only wanted to be respected for his political power, but also for his military dominance, ensuring that France would be a force to be reckoned with throughout Europe. But as much as his military strength was admired, it was also the Porphyrian's reign to its limits. The constant campaigns not only drained France's finances, but also began to damage the king's image as a wise and prudent ruler. What had previously been seen as a glorious monarch, victorious in battles, now began to be associated with a king who dragged his country into endless wars, with disastrous consequences. One of the most controversial decisions of Louis XIV's reign was the revocation of the Edict of Nantes by the Edict of Fontainebleau in 1685. The Edict of Nantes, issued in 1598 by King Henry I, guaranteed French Protestants the right to practice their religion freely and granted them a number of civil rights. The edict was an attempt to end the bloody wars of religion between Catholics and Protestants in France, but during Louis XIV's reign, religious tensions again rose. Although Louis XIV was a devout Catholic, he initially upheld the Edict of Nantes, recognizing that Protestants were an important part of French society. However, over time, he began to feel pressure from a section of the church and the Catholic nobility to eradicate Protestantism from France, as there was a growing belief that religious unity was essential to the stability of the kingdom. In 1685, Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes with the Edict of Fontainebleau, declaring that Protestantism would be banned and that all Protestants must convert to Catholicism. This decision had a devastating effect on French Protestants, known as Huguenots. Those who refused to convert were persecuted, their churches were destroyed, and many were forced to live in conditions of extreme discrimination. One of the most immediate consequences of this revocation was that hundreds of thousands of Huguenots fled France to neighboring countries such as England, the Netherlands, and Germany. This had a negative impact on the country's economy, as many of the Huguenots who fled were highly skilled merchants, artisans, and professionals. The loss of so many talented people weakened France economically and culturally. Furthermore, the revocation of the Edict of Nantes angered other Protestant nations, who saw Louis XIV's decision as an act of religious intolerance. The decision to persecute Protestants rather than promote peaceful coexistence ended up weakening the international image of France, which until then had been seen as a tolerant power that respected religious freedoms. Louis XIV saw himself as an absolute monarch, with the right to decide on all aspects of the kingdom including religion. He believed that religious unity was essential to the strengthening of the state. However, the persecution of the Huguenots and the revocation of the Edict of Nantes had consequences not only for France, but also for his own image as a ruler. Although the monarch succeeded in consolidating Catholicism in France, the measure weakened society and contributed to the growing division between the classes and between the kingdom and the rest of Protestant Europe. The Edict of Fontainebleau was not an unqualified victory for Louis XIV. Although he succeeded in imposing his religious vision, the result was a divided nation, with many Protestants forced into exile, and an economy that suffered as skilled workers fled. As France became more religiously homogeneous, it also became more closed and intolerant, which over time could hamper its ability to adapt to political and social change. Louis XIV was not only a monarch focused on political and military power, he also understood, like few before him, the importance of culture as a tool to legitimize his power. He wanted his image to be associated with the pinnacle of civilization, and he knew that art and culture could reinforce that image. The Palace of Versailles, his greatest masterpiece, was not only a symbol of absolute power, but also a cultural center where art, music, and theater flourished as a way to celebrate and glorify the reign of the Sun King. Louis XIV used his court as a platform to promote the arts and culture. He knew that by patronizing music, theater, and the visual arts, he was not only creating a cultural legacy, but also strengthening his image as the ideal ruler. Rather than simply conquering and controlling, he wanted to be seen as a monarch who uplifted the spirit of the nation. Under the reign of Louis XIV, French classical music enjoyed a major revival. The king founded the Royal Academy of Music and encouraged the creation of operas and ballets to be performed at Versailles. The king himself was a great enthusiast of music and dance, and many of his own courtiers were renowned musicians, dancers, and artists. The famous composer Jean-Baptiste Lully, for example, was appointed master of court music and composed numerous works for the court of Versailles, many of which were performed at the great parties and spectacles that Louis XIV hosted. But it wasn't just music that flourished. Theater also became a major political tool. Louis XIV patronized playwrights and artists who created theatrical works that extolled his greatness and the magnificence of his kingdom. In addition, gardening and the fine arts also flourished at Versailles, with artists creating sculptures and paintings that glorified the king and his court. The gardens of Versailles, in particular, were designed to reflect the order and perfection of nature under the monarch's control. The immense maze of gardens, fountains, and statues symbolized order and the centralization of power, in an expression that nature, like society, was being shaped to the king's will. In addition to his lavish parties and spectacles, Louis XIV also encouraged literature. Great names such as Molière, the famous French playwright, had the opportunity to present their comedies at the court of Versailles. Through his plays, such as Tartuffe and the Misanthrope, Molière was able to criticize in a veiled way French society and even the behavior of the nobles and the king himself, without anyone feeling directly attacked. All of this was part of a grand design by Louis XIV to strengthen his cultural and political dominance. He knew that a court full of artists and intellectuals not only flattered his ego, but also cemented his position as a monarch who represented the intellectual and cultural supremacy of France. In this sense, Versailles became the cultural center not only of France, but of all of Europe. The Sun King not only wanted to be the center of political power, but also the epitome of sophistication and cultural refinement. However, this emphasis on culture also brought some criticism. The extravagant life and lavish parties of Versailles contrasted sharply with the hardships faced by the French people. Many questioned whether all this ostentation actually benefited France as a whole, but for Louis XIV, investing in the arts was, in a way to boost national morale and maintain his authority. Louis XIV's reign was marked by absolute control, but he knew he could not rule alone. Although he had all the authority in his hands, he needed the nobility to carry out his will and ensure the stability of the kingdom. However, the way he dealt with the nobility was unique and very strategic. He used the nobility not as a natural ally, but as a group that had to be kept under control to avoid any threat to his power. Throughout his reign, Louis XIV adopted a radically centralizing approach. He dissolved the privileges of the regional nobility, reducing their authority and leaving them with little political influence outside of Versailles. The king knew that if he allowed the nobles to have too much power in the regions, it could create pockets of resistance to his centralized rule. He therefore invited the nobility to live at Versailles, close to him, and made their lives revolve around the court. But this proximity had a clear purpose: to subject the nobility to the king's control. They were forced to submit to a series of rituals and rules of etiquette that kept them busy and distracted, competing with each other for royal favors. At Versailles, the great figures of the nobility were far from their lands and armies, which made them unable to challenge the king directly. Life at the court of Versailles, with its intrigues, power struggles, and trivialities, made the nobles dependent on the king to rise in society or maintain their status. The nobles had to please Louis XIV, a task that involved pleasing his court, participating in lavish ceremonies, and even submitting to his personal control. The rigid hierarchy at the court of Versailles forced even the most powerful nobles to compete for royal favor. Those who stood out and pleased the king were rewarded with privileges and lands, but those who did not fit the rules or posed a threat to the monarch's power were marginalized or even punished. Louis XIV knew that the nobility needed to be controlled, and his method of ruling was a way to minimize revolts and prevent the aristocracy from becoming a threat to his absolute rule. While this granted him some control over the nobility, it was also a sign that he did not fully trust his nobles. He kept them close to him, but prevented them from gaining real power. However, the centralization of power also created another problem. Louis XIV's ministers and advisors, who became the real day-to-day rulers. The centralized bureaucracy grew, and these ministers became figures of great influence, but they were always under the direct control of the king. Louis XIV's rule, therefore, was based on a combination of absolute control over the nobility and a highly centralized bureaucratic system. He allowed no authority to challenge his absolute power, not even the nobles, who could previously have been a counterbalance to the monarch. While this strategy suppressed the threat from the nobility and allowed Louis XIV to rule with force, it also came at a cost. As he consolidated his power, the nobility resented his lack of autonomy and his need to always please the king. This created a highly competitive and often purposeless court, where the nobles were more concerned with currying favor than with taking concrete actions that would benefit the nation. The centralization of power and control over the nobility worked for Louis XIV for much of his reign, but at the same time it began to create a nobility that was only a shadow of its former power, and that, over time would lose its importance in the French political scene. Louis XIV was not only a powerful king, he knew exactly how to cultivate and project his image. Throughout his reign, he transformed his monarch figure into a symbol of absolute power, creating a divine and unbeatable aura around him. He wanted to be seen not only as the King of France, but as a leader chosen by God, someone whose authority should not be questioned. His image was carefully crafted so that he would be perceived as the center of everything in France, the Sun King, the star of the country's political and cultural system. This image of power and authority began with the title he adopted, the Sun King. This choice was not accidental. The sun was seen as the center of the universe, the star that gave life and order to everything around it. Louis XIV thus saw himself as the center of France's political, social, and cultural life, the source of all the kingdom's light and vitality. He wanted everyone to see France revolving around him, just as planet Earth revolves around the sun. To reinforce this image, Louis XIV surrounded himself with artists, painters, and architects who helped create a visual representation of his greatness. The paintings, sculptures, and even the decorations at Versailles reflected this vision. Many of the paintings of Louis XIV show him as an imposing, almost godlike figure, dressed in luxurious attire and with an unshakable posture of authority. He was often depicted with a serious and confident expression, almost as if he were the one responsible for maintaining order and stability in the world. But it wasn't just about portraits. The coronation ceremony and the parties at Versailles were grand, always intended to reinforce this image of an absolute monarch. Every event at court had a symbolic meaning and was an opportunity for the king to present himself as the central figure, the point of reference for all power in the kingdom. The rituals and protocols of the court were also organized in such a way as to highlight his importance and divinity. He wanted all nobles, officials, and subjects to know that he was the last word in everything, that his decisions were final and could not be questioned. Furthermore, Louis XIV's reign was also marked by intense political propaganda, something far ahead of its time. The king used his court and the cultural stage of Versailles to exalt the image of the monarchy and convey the message that the social order was directly linked to his figure. The very use of the title Sun King was a way of ensuring that no one would forget that he was the supreme ruler above all others. However, the construction of this image of perfection and divinity was not without its critics. Many saw the ostentation and luxury of the court as a symbol of the king's excessive vanity. Although he successfully consolidated his absolute power, the image of a divine king also isolated him from the people, who began to see the monarch as distant and immune to the hardships they faced. The endless wars, the great expenses of the court, and the high taxes levied to support the Versailles lifestyle began to generate discontent in a nation that, although largely in the hands of the king, felt the weight of his grandiosity. Yet the image of Louis XIV as the Sun King has endured through the centuries. He was one of the first monarchs to use his own public image so effectively to secure and consolidate his power, something that would influence other monarchs and political leaders throughout history. His image of absolute power and his presence as the central figure of the kingdom became inseparable from the very idea of monarchy in Europe. The court of Versailles became, without a doubt, the most luxurious and dazzling in Europe during the reign of Louis IV. It was not only a place of government, but also a center of entertainment, where ostentation and grandeur were present in every aspect of daily life. For the Sun King, Versailles was the perfect reflection of his absolute majority and his vision of the world. He wanted every visitor who came to Versailles to be impressed and enchanted by the magnificence of the place and the image of power that he and his court represented. Palace of Versailles itself was an architectural masterpiece, but it was not just its imposing architecture that captivated people. The daily ritual at court was a spectacle in itself. The nobles were constantly engaged in a constant competition, trying to stand out in the eyes of the king and gain a little more of his favor. Behavior at court was governed by strict rules and meticulous ceremonies, which reflected the hierarchy and control that Louis XIV had over everyone. Every detail, from the king's awakening to the lavish dinners, had a specific ceremony, attended by nobles and courtiers who competed for prestigious positions. The parties were frequent and were a true spectacle of ostentation and wealth. Banquets were abundant and cultural performances, such as operas, ballets, and plays, were part of daily life at Versailles. In addition, the extravagant fashions of the court were also part of the exuberance. The clothes, full of embroidery and expensive fabrics, reflected the status of those who wore them, but also the greatness of Louis XIV, who wanted his court to be seen as the most refined and glorious in Europe. The court of Versailles was not only a place of luxury, but also a field of intrigue and power games. Although the king controlled absolutely every aspect of political life, he also knew that the nobles needed to feel part of his circle. This created a competitive environment where the nobles tried to please Louis XIV in every possible way in exchange for favors and privileges. But this power game had its drawbacks. The distribution of power among the nobles became increasingly concentrated around the figure of the king, and any attempt to rebel against royal authority was simply crushed. For those who failed to gain the monarch's good graces, the consequences could be severe, with exile or a fall from grace. However, despite all the grandeur, the relentless focus on ostentation and absolute control of the court also brought problems. Political survival at the court of Versailles became based more on appearances and favors than on true merit. The nobles were more concerned with maintaining their prestigious positions than with governing or effectively administering the regions of France. This, of course, contributed to an impoverishment of institutions and public administration. The extravagance of the court, while having a positive impact on Louis XIV's international prestige, also put a great strain on the kingdom's finances, which were already stretched thin by the cost of wars and maintaining its lifestyle. And over time, the disconnect between the luxury of the court and the reality of the masses became evident. While the nobles reveled in grand feasts and extravagant balls, the people of France suffered from poverty, high taxes, and increasing economic hardship. The contrast between life at court and the hardships of the people became increasingly glaring. Although the court at Versailles was the height of sophistication and splendor, it was also a reflection of a regime that was increasingly out of touch with reality. This set the stage for future tensions that would later be one of the factors that led to the downfall of the French monarchy. Louis XIV held absolute sway over France, but the absolute power he wielded required constant manipulation of the nobility and the ministers of the kingdom. His dealings with the nobility were both a reflection of his vision of governing and a form of political control to ensure his continued power. However, this relationship with the nobility was not as simple as voluntary submission. The king had to use a complex strategy to transform the nobility into a group that posed no threat to his power, but rather a tool for centralized control. Before Louis XIV, the nobility in France had a great deal of autonomy and local power. They controlled vast territories, private armies, and had a direct influence on regional politics. This posed a threat to central power, as the nobility could rebel or challenge the authority of the monarch. Louis XIV understood that the division of power between the monarch and the local nobility needed to be eliminated in order to ensure a strong, centralized monarchy. To this end, he had all the nobles gathered at the court of Versailles. By inviting the nobility to live close to him, he created a dynamic where everyone depended on the king to maintain their power and privileges. Versailles became a stage where there was constant competition for royal approval, and the nobles were more concerned with pleasing the king than with governing their lands. Louis XIV understood that the lack of real political power among the nobility could be to his advantage, as it would prevent any movement of rebellion or insurrection. The Versailles nobility, despite its appearance of grandeur, was constantly controlled by the king. The nobles competed with each other for titles, lands, and favors, resulting in a constant struggle for prestige. This dependence on the king was an effective strategy to ensure that the nobility became an obsolete class in terms of political power. Although they continued to be an important force in the social and cultural fields, they were seen more as extras in the grand court spectacle than as autonomous rulers. However, the relationship between the king and the nobility also brought complications. On the one hand, Louis XIV managed to secure his absolute authority, but on the other hand, he also created a highly competitive and intricate system where the nobility became extremely dependent on the king. Over time, this caused the nobility to become alienated from the reality of the French people, who increasingly saw the court as a symbol of excessive luxury and frivolity, while facing economic and social hardships. Furthermore, this concentration of power also led to the emergence of ministers and bureaucrats who became key figures in the government. By controlling the ministers directly, Louis XIV maintained control over political decisions, but this also meant that the administration of the kingdom was increasingly distanced from the traditional nobility, creating a social and political distance that would be felt for generations to come. In short, Louis XIV's relationship with the nobility was a complex dynamic of absolute control and political manipulation. He managed to weaken the power of the local nobility, but at the same time he became increasingly dependent on ministers and advisors, which would eventually create a centralized bureaucracy and a court devoid of real political action, but full of intrigue and internal competition. After a reign that lasted an astonishing 72 years, longer than any other French or European monarch, up to that point, Louis XIV finally took his leave of life in 1715. His death marked the end of an era of glory and excess, but also the beginning of a profound crisis for France. Throughout his reign, Louis XIV achieved great victories, not only in the military field, but also in terms of cultural prestige and the consolidation of absolute power. He transformed France into the greatest power in Europe and established a model of absolute monarchy that would influence kingdoms and empires around the world. Versailles, as the center of his court and symbol of his power, was the place where he shaped his image and where royal power was exercised in an almost divine manner. However, by the end of his life, France was far from being the prosperous and invincible empire he had envisioned. Incessant wars, such as the War of the Spanish Succession, and the excessive luxury of the court had drained the country's resources. Louis XIII's reign had left France with enormous debts, and the aristocracy, although completely dependent on him, was also beginning to feel the consequences of his policies of extravagance. France, with its finances exhausted and a nobility disconnected from the needs of the people, was on the brink of crisis. When Louis XIV died, the country was in a fragile economic position, and the problems of his policy of centralization began to become even more evident. His successor, Louis XV, would have to deal with a series of difficulties inherited from the reign of the Sun King. The nobility, which Louis XIV had controlled with an iron fist, would become one of the main challenges for the new monarch, who lacked the same charisma and authority as his grandfather. The death of Louis XIV also symbolized the failure of his model of absolute monarchy. The Great Palace of Versailles, the culture of opulence and the battles for prestige that had characterized his court, began to seem distant from the reality of the majority of the population. The social tensions that had accumulated during his reign between the court of Versailles and the French people would culminate in the French Revolution in the following century. The figure of the Sun King, despite his grandeur, could not prevent the emergence of a revolutionary movement that would question not only the figure of the monarch, but the entire system of privileges he had established. Despite the majesty of his reign and the military feats of his glory days, France, which he had planned as an unbeatable power, was preparing for the beginning of a new era, an era where absolutism would be challenged and overthrown. Louis XIV left a legacy that profoundly marked the history of France and the world both positively and negatively. His reign was a time of greatness and ostentation, but also of excesses and hardships that in the long run harmed France. Throughout his 72-year reign, he was responsible for an extraordinary consolidation of monarchical power, transforming it into a model of absolute monarchy that exerted great influence on other countries in Europe. He created a figure of a king who stood above everything and everyone, a sovereign whose power seemed to be given by God and whose authority could not be challenged. His famous motto, "Le State, c'est moi," the state is me, sums up this view. He was the personification of the French state. Louis XIV's impact on culture and art was immense. Versailles was not only the seat of his government, but also a cultural center where the arts flourished. He encouraged music, theater, painting, and architecture, which gave France a prestigious cultural legacy. Artists, such as Molière and Lully, became icons under his patronage, and the Palace of Versailles remains one of the greatest architectural masterpieces of all time. However, the negative side of his legacy cannot be ignored. Constant warfare, such as the War of the Spanish Succession, and the cost of maintaining his extravagant court and centralized administration, placed France deeply in debt. By the end of his reign, the country was in a severe financial crisis, with the people suffering under the burden of high taxes to support the lavishness of the court and military spending. This overstretched economy, would be one of the crucial factors that led to the French Revolution in the late 18th century. Furthermore, Louis XIV's absolutism, although it created a strong monarchical power, also undermined the state's resilience. When he died, the power structure he had built was so dependent on his authority that his successor, Louis XV, did not have the same strength to maintain the cohesion of the kingdom. The lack of a solid transition and the fragility of the institutions created by Louis XIV made the monarchy vulnerable to political and social crises that would culminate in its overthrow. In social terms, the isolation of the nobility from their regional responsibilities and the growing disconnect between the court and the people contributed to the alienation of the popular classes. The contrast between the wealth of Versailles and the misery of the French people became increasingly unbearable, and this would prepare the ground for the great social and political change that would come with the revolution. Therefore, the legacy of Louis XIV is, in many ways, a reflection of the complexity of his reign. He was a monarch of immense talent and greatness, but his decisions also came at a heavy cost, and his way of governing, while effective for a time, proved unsustainable in the long term. He left a France marked by cultural greatness, but also by financial and political challenges that would eventually explode into one of the most transformative events in modern history, the French Revolution. Despite the criticism, Louis XIV will always be remembered as the monarch who symbolized the idea of absolute power, someone who managed to transform the French monarchy into a glorious and grand empire, but who at the same time planted the seeds of his own downfall. Hey guys, if you enjoyed learning more about the history of Louis XIV, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like it and comment on what surprised you most about the history of this great king. Don't miss the next incredible stories of kings and queens. See you in the next video.